Of 4-year-old Jessica Gutierrez. The little girl was taken from her family's home in 1986, and her body has never been found.
It was just past 9 in the morning on June 6, 1986, and a mother named Debbie was standing in the hallway, not yet understanding what she was looking at. The front door was wide open. The family dog was running loose through the living room, and across the bedroom floor, papers had been scattered like something had swept through in a hurry. The bed her two daughters had shared the night before had only one child in it. The day before had been ordinary, completely unremarkably ordinary. The Gutierrez family lived in a small home on South Lake Drive in Lexington County, South Carolina, a quiet stretch of the state where people left their windows open in summer and knew their neighbors by name. Debbie was raising 4 children, largely on her own. Her husband had moved out of state, and she had built a life around routine. That evening was no different. Jessica was 4 years old, the youngest of 4. She would normally have slept in her mother's bed, but her older brother had an earache that night, so Debbie let him take her spot. It was a small decision, the kind a parent makes without thinking. As a result, Jessica ended up sharing a bed with her 6-year-old sister, Rebecca, in the girls' room, for the first and only time. She was already asleep when Debbie tucked them in, wearing her pajamas, small and still, the room quiet around her. Sometime in the night, Rebecca woke up. There was a man standing beside the bed. He had a beard. He was wearing a tall hat. He reached down, picked up the sleeping Jessica, unplugged the fan, unplugged the nightlight, and walked out. Rebecca lay in the dark, alone, certain she was dreaming, as she pulled the blanket over her head and eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, she walked out and asked her mother for cereal. It was only when Debbie looked past her, at the open front door, the scattered papers, the curtain rod lying on the floor beneath the back window, the screen removed from its frame, that the shape of what had happened began to form. She went to the girls' room. 1 bed, 1 child. She asked Rebecca where her sister was. Rebecca said, "She's gone. A man with a beard and a magic hat took her." "10 weeks after Jessica disappeared, a man was arrested in North Carolina, van theft, breaking into a woman's home, assault, routine crimes on paper, until his fingerprints were entered into the FBI database. They matched the print on the Gutierrez window. Exactly. His name was Thomas Eric McDow. He was 27 years old, and when investigators brought that name to Debbie, she didn't need them to describe him. She knew exactly who he was. She had hired him. 6 months earlier, McDowell had been brought in through relatives to build a shed and repair an awning on the property. He had been there. He had worked there. He had stood in her yard while her children played around him. McDowell had a beard. He wore a tall cowboy hat, the kind that, to a 6-year-old girl in a dark room in the middle of the night, all might look exactly like a wizard's hat. There was something else. At some point while McDowell was working on the property, Debbie had locked herself out of the house. The only way back in was through a window. She climbed through it while McDowell stood outside and watched. It was the same window the kidnapper used to enter the home. He had seen her do it. Months later, he came back through the same window. Jessica would have turned 5 that December. McDowell was in custody by September. But what came next was not a murder charge. It was a decision. Authorities said the evidence wasn't enough. No body, no confession. The fingerprint, they argued, could have been left during McDowell's repair works months before. Debbie told them that was impossible. She cleaned that window constantly because her children touched it every day. Forensic experts reviewed the print and agreed. It was fresh, unweathered. It had not been sitting on that glass for months. It made no difference. He was sentenced to 10 years in North Carolina for the crimes he committed there. Jessica's case was quietly set aside, and Thomas McDowell went to prison for everything except what he actually did. While Thomas McDowell served his time in North Carolina, Debbie was back in South Carolina, and the phone on her kitchen wall was still being recorded. 2 days after Jessica vanished, before investigators had any suspect, before the fingerprint had been found and dismissed, Debbie had accused the local sheriff of moving too slowly. His response was not to move faster. He told her that if she kept making accusations, he would pull his men off the case and simply forget it existed. What he did not know, what no one had told him, was that the recording device installed for a ransom call was still running. Every word he said went onto tape. Debbie kept that tape. It would be years before she could do anything with it. In the meantime, she waited for the system to act, and the system did not. Then, while McDowell was in prison, as his cellmate contacted police, he said McDowell had told him what happened to Jessica, how she died, what he did with her remains, and where he had left her. McDowell, through his attorney, confirmed he would provide a full formal confession. His condition was complete immunity from prosecution. Authorities refused. McDowell went silent, and the cellmate, left with information that no institution seemed willing to use, did the only thing he had left to do. He wrote a letter. He sent it to Debbie. Stories like this one take time and care to get right. And if this channel has earned your trust, please take a second to subscribe and hit the like button. What comes next in this case is something that should have changed everything, and didn't. Now, back to the case. Debbie read the letter, and then she went to work herself. Thus, she located an abandoned car that had previously belonged to McDowell. Inside it, she found fabric fibers. They matched the pajamas Jessica had been wearing the night she was taken. She brought what she had found to police. They declined to pursue it. Their stated reason was that they found it strange, a civilian finding evidence that a full investigative team had not. The lead went nowhere. The fibers went nowhere. In 1987, investigators believed they had found Jessica alive in Kansas. They called Debbie. She listened to the girl's voice on the other end of the line and said nothing for a moment. Then she told them it was not her daughter. She knew. She had known before the call was over. In 1991, Jessica became the first missing child in South Carolina to have an age-progressed portrait created, a computer-generated image of who she might have looked like at 10 years old. It was the closest anyone could get to showing who she was becoming. The years passed. The case did not move. In 2007, Debbie released the recorded phone call publicly, the one where the sheriff had threatened to walk away. He denied it, claimed he had actually added officers. In 2014, that same sheriff was dismissed from office and jailed for 12 months for fraud and bribery. The prosecutor who had spent years blocking Debbie's attempts to involve outside agencies resigned in 2016 after a drunk hit-and-run arrest. The people who had failed Jessica most completely eventually faced consequences, just never for what they had done to her. For 35 years, the case sat in a drawer. The man who knew what happened was free. The woman who found the evidence was told to stop looking. And Jessica Gutierrez remained exactly where she had been since June 6, 1986, missing. In 2021, 35 years after Jessica Gutierrez disappeared, a new sheriff took over Lexington County. His name was Jay Kuhn. One of his first decisions was to reopen the case. This was not a quiet review. Kuhn brought in the FBI's child abduction team and agents from SLED, the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division. More than 50 investigators. More than 125 people re-interviewed. What they found changed everything. People who had known McDowell in 1986 told investigators something they had never been asked before. Immediately after Jessica vanished, McDowell had changed his appearance. He cut his long hair, he shaved his beard, and he threw away his favorite cowboy hat, the tall one he wore everywhere. The same hat a 6-year-old girl, alone in a dark room, had described as a wizard's hat. Witnesses also confirmed he smoked the same brand of cigarettes found outside the Gutierrez window the morning Jessica disappeared. Investigators tested the discarded hat and the cigarette butts for DNA. Both samples were too degraded from prior testing to yield a result. But the fingerprint, the one lifted from the exterior of the window in 1986, was re-examined. It still held. It was still fresh. It was still his. In January 2022, Thomas McDowell was arrested at his home in Wake Forest, North Carolina. He was 62 years old. The trial opened in early 2024. His defense attorneys argued the evidence was circumstantial. They told the jury that a cowboy hat and a wizard's hat are completely different things, that a child's description proved nothing. The prosecution answered that argument with a simpler one. McDowell's cellmate had described in specific detail what happened to Jessica and where her remains had been left. He was from another state. He had no connection to the family. There was no way he could have known those details unless McDowell had told him. 3 days of testimony, 2 hours of deliberation. On February 8, 2024, the jury found Thomas McDowell guilty on all counts: first-degree burglary, kidnapping, and murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. Jessica would have turned 42 just months before the verdict. The age-progressed portrait created in 1991, the image of who she might have become, was the only version of that future that ever existed. After the verdict, Debbie spoke briefly. She said she was relieved the right decision had been made, and that her daughter's killer was finally off the streets. 38 years. That was how long she had waited to say it. Thomas McDowell was transferred to the South Carolina Department of Corrections. He knew where Jessica was. He had always known. And he chose every single day for 38 years to say nothing. The guilty verdict did not bring Jessica home. It never could have. What it brought was an end to the question of who. That question had been answered, quietly and completely, within 10 weeks of her disappearance. But the system that held the answer had spent 38 years choosing not to act on it. The verdict closed the case. It did not fill what the case had left behind. Jessica's remains have never been found. Her mother never got to bury her. The only physical trace of her ever recovered was a handful of fabric fibers, pulled from an abandoned car by a woman with no forensic training, no badge, and no institutional support. A woman who was then told by police that it was strange she had found something they hadn't. Those fibers matched the pajamas Jessica was wearing the night she was carried out of her bed. Yet that is all that was ever recovered, not by investigators, by her mother. Debbie spent 38 years doing what the system would not. She kept the tape. She found the car. She listened to a stranger's voice in Kansas and knew, before the call was over, that it wasn't her daughter. She was told to stop. She was blocked, dismissed, and outlasted every official who stood in her way. The verdict gave her something real. It did not give her Jessica back. Jessica Gutierrez was 4 years old, the youngest of 4 children, asleep in a bed she had never slept in before. That is where this story began. When a mother finds evidence that trained investigators couldn't or wouldn't, what does that say about who the justice system is actually built to protect? Rebecca was awake when the man took Jessica. She saw him. Do you think screaming in that moment could have saved her sister? And can we really blame a 6-year-old for thinking it was just a dream? Thomas McDowell had 38 years of ordinary life, while Debbie had 38 years of none. Is that gap its own form of injustice, separate from anything a courtroom can answer? Jessica's pajamas were the only piece of her that was ever found, not by the police, by her mother. The case is closed now, but Jessica is still out there, somewhere, in a field that no one has ever searched. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Crime Chronicles. Every case we cover is one that took decades to close and deserves to be remembered. Hit the like button. It helps more people find these stories. And if there is a cold case you think we should cover next, leave it in the comments below.